Hey everyone, welcome to the ProgCast. I'm Gregg Bendian, your host, and this time around, trying something a little bit different. As many of you know, I'm a big comic book geek and have my fingers in the comic book world in a few different ways. Get into that in a minute, but today my guest is Duncan Rouleau. He's a comic book illustrator and writer. He's involved heavily with animation. He has drawn some of my favorite characters like Venom and X-Men, Superman, the Metal Men for DC and Marvel. He's also worked for Dark Horse and Image. His team, Man of Action, have created Ben 10 and also Big Hero 6, the film that many of you might be familiar with. He is a big music fan, an old friend, and a huge part of my jazz album, Requiem for Jack Kirby, tribute to the great comic book creator. And we're going to get into all this kind of stuff and more. So grateful to have him here today. Hi, Duncan Rouleau.
Hey, it's good to be here, Greg. Very excited. Very excited. Talk all things Kirby is always a good thing. So
yeah, man, and the whole visual world, which has inspired so many musicians and people who have been watching the ProgCast have seen me get Andy Partridge of XTC to completely fess up to his love of Kirby, Ditko, Coleman, and more, Wally Wood. So it's really fun to kind of juggle those worlds. And I know that, I've met a lot of comic book artists and visual artists who have been inspired by music, and a lot of musicians who have been inspired by the visual world. In fact, many of them start as graphic artists like Andy Partridge, and then they decide that they're going to do something with music, so that's a whole thing. But Duncan, I'm curious about your beginnings in terms of comics or just the visual. What got you excited to pick up the pencil? What got you going?
Probably, I mean, if I was to kind of isolate it, I most definitely grew up in a family. My father was a graphic artist. My mom was an art teacher. So I grew up with a visual parents. They both interacted visually. Oddly enough, I have three older brothers. One became a lawyer and the other two became engineers. So I was the only one who followed in the family business, so to speak. So, I mean, I guess I just kind of had born into the firmament of it a little bit, but the way that I feel like I got into it was a very crowded, loud household. So art was a way that I could create a space for myself to just kind of gather my thoughts, mark out who I was outside of a group, inside, as an individual. I also had a couple of learning deficiencies. I have a slight dyslexia, so I was a little slow on the reading. So comic books was instead of facing a novel initially, comic books were something that was a gateway to reading for me too. So there was a marriage of visual and words that really appealed to me at an early age, and the idea of, and this is really what I think of. I think where I find that music and comic book art specifically have a unique crossover. In the writing of the words, sometimes you want to have a very different narrative than the visual narrative. You want to layer these things, so it creates a deeper, fuller picture. One person is saying something, and this happens in acting too with the performers, but the visuals that are happening could be it could be a counter that, they could be dovetailing it, they could be, there's a lot of different ways that you could look at it. And I really see that the way that those things interact, it's the same way as if you were to arrange a piece of music. You were trying to find certain passages or whatever to emphasize differently, give it different colors, different moods, different tones, and things like that. And so my other big love was music, like you had said. So I just saw an interesting marriage between those in that place. So it checked a lot of boxes for me. It gave me a personal space. It gave me a connection to my parents. It gave me a voice, and it also offered me, oddly enough, a way of kind of structuring my environment. So, I mean, if I was to kind of get down to it in those base ways, and let's face it, it's really cool. And I was being part of a larger community was always exciting, and that was something that I think I fell in love with. It was a secret club. You know, nowadays I'm kind of a little baffled, and maybe perhaps you are too, about how all of these kind of these kind of side loves, like comic books and Dungeons and Dragons and all of these things that are called nerd culture now are front and center. You know, that they're a major part of the popular culture, and that so many people know who Jack Kirby is now, or Stan Lee for that matter, even on a level beyond just name recognition. Is kind of amazing to me, because these things were not growing up. These were offshoots. These were things that you had to go and hunt for and find your people. and you know, this was an exotic safari when I was a kid, and I think that also appealed to me in a way that just wasn't pop mainstream. Now it is.
Yeah, I mean, that is remarkable. And I talk about it frequently. You know, things I spent 20 cents on now are worth thousands of dollars.
It is kind of ridiculous when you start to put even when you put a financial price on it too. That's, I suppose, a very good metric. I'm just also thinking now. When I was a kid, it was really kind of a male-centric. Comic books were very male-centric, and now they're not. And I'm so glad for that. I'm so glad for that. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. But the fact that, and to me, that's where its real worth is where you're going to get new ideas, new voices, new people who are going to come in and contribute to the medium. Because I really do love the medium a great deal. So.
Yeah, in fact, the medium has become quite welcoming. Mm-hmm. And the diversity that is developed within the comic world has been impressive so far, and it's going to be even more so as we go forward, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, you know, it's always been a kind of a process of taking, for lack of a better term, mythology and using it as an allegory to tell real world issues. Mm-hmm. You know, there's a level of separation that's safe, especially when you get into emotionally charged and politically charged times. These allegories seem to be able to operate in a way that, you know, maybe a more direct method doesn't penetrate, or doesn't have as much room to kind of engage people and create discussion that this kind of allegory, this type of storytelling, this kind of allegory mythology storytelling does. And the fact that you get a much wider and broader kind of platform of people discussing it in these terms, I think ultimately it's very useful. At some point, I think it's very important to get to brass tacks and real stuff. But if this is a good place for people to at least start to engage with each other, great. You know,
I remember, you know, you mentioned how we're sort of able to tell stories with allegory, with even political angles. And I remember as a kid picking up Captain America when he was becoming disillusioned with America and became the nomad. Do you remember that run?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. You know, it was interesting. If I remember correctly, that the timing for that was not too soon after kind of the bicentennial fervor. You know, the 1776, the 1976 kind of fervor. That it was like 77, 78, I want to say tops 77 or even 76 with Nomad kind of coming in. It was very interesting. It was a little jarring for me as a kid because I was so wrapped up into the hoopla to have this. And if anything, it gave me in a lot of ways, I credit it as giving me a pause of not getting caught up in too much fervor and establishing kind of a more objective eye on what's good and, what's being fed to me a little bit. So yes, and I don't think that, all of the accusations coming out now that it's also woke and it's politically correct. It's like, I actually remember going back to Captain America being such a great touchstone for politics.
Mm,
In Avengers #4, when they first find Captain America and they put him in a hotel room because he's just needs sleep. He's been, obviously on ice for 20 some odd years. There's a thunderstorm outside raging, and he has flashbacks of Bucky and of war with the thunder and the lightning. And I was thinking to myself, that's a generation that is talking about two kids post-traumatic stress syndrome. We're talking about, kind of the effects of war. And they didn't have, or the culture at the time, it wasn't really easy for people to talk about any of that kind of stuff or even kind of process it.
right.
They just had to keep it contained. So the fact that these guys were finding creative ways of being able to discuss those things inside of these heroes. And I mean, I don't think I caught on to it until a little later. I just knew that people would be haunted by, horrible traumatic events. I didn't know, any of the other stuff that, that these guys actually fought. And so they had a perspective that they were bringing in there that was very real, very credible, and they were finding a way to process it. And I just think that's incredible. It's that's sophisticated stuff and quote unquote kids material.
Right. We didn't know that we were being fed sophisticated concepts, but we were being nourished by this.
And yeah, that's right. And that I think ultimately what resonated for me, and this is something also that we do with our own work, is kids are a hell of a lot smarter than some executives like to think, or these kind of people who think about demographics. They conflate what they conflate what the parent thinks the kid should be interested in and what the kid is interested in. And what was so great about comics is that, and even with the comics code and all of these other kinds of things, these creators were still finding ways to engage with kids and who are human, who don't maybe have this deep drawer of an experience pool, but they've experienced traumas too, so they can recognize these things. And the fact that anybody's talking to you about these things and that your heroes are finding ways to work through them is a gift, as far as I'm concerned. And so uh, I think that what I really appreciate about specifically Marvel at that time is that they were engaging with people at a more sophisticated human level at the time. And I really appreciate it. I think that was a lesson I learned at the time, and I carry it on. So
Yeah. And it wasn't too long after Nixon.
no, no, before. It was before Nixon. Some of that stuff was even before Nixon. We're talking, well, Nixon as president.
I mean, Nixon, Nixon
Watergate. Nixon.
leaving in Watergate and all of that. I always felt had that nomad story was connected.
Mm.
It was a sort of a response to that,
I think you're right. No, I absolutely think you're right. That was, somebody once had this to say, because I don't know when you were born, but I'm one of these people that I was born, I could be considered the last year of a baby boomer or the first year of Generation X.
Hmm.
And the way that I had somebody describe it to me, and it kind of, I thought it resonated, was if you were a baby boomer, then you were seeing America on ascension, all the good things, blah, 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 man on the moon, that being one of the culminations of all of our kind of post-war successes, and all of that. And that Generation X was, then you saw Challenger, you saw Nixon, you saw all of these other kinds of things, these less than spectacular aspects of the country in its travels. And I mean, I know what resonates more with me. I mean, I do remember the moon landing, but I was more impacted by all the things that you were just talking about Nixon and whatnot. And I think that disillusionment, the nomad thing, all of that, that's that's some Generation X stuff, where you start going, okay, the pretty veneer is off. Kennedy's dead. Presidents are cheaters and liars, and politicians are not all unfallible. They can be just as spooky as anybody else. So.
Now, was that a Steve Engelhart run?
Yes, it was actually. That's right. Yeah.
And Sal drawing, right? Was it?
That feels right. He was drawing at that time. I'm just thinking of some of the covers that he did do. So, Gil Kane did a few covers during that run, the Golden Archer stuff and whatnot. So I think you're right. On the interiors, it was Sal. I'm going to go with you on that without checking it up. So somebody out there will correct me.
Somebody will correct us if we're wrong.
Right.
I have a feeling. I almost made the mistake of telling Andy Partridge that Ant-Man's first appearance was in Tales of Suspense, and I immediately corrected myself.
On it.
Sorry, but I didn't let that go. But tell me who your favorite reads were back then. What were you excited about? What were you collecting? What were you trying to find? And did you have shops? Because we only had a candy store.
Yeah, no, I didn't. My first experience with a comic book store was, I don't know if you remember, in the mid 70s, I want to say around 75, 76, 77, somewhere in there, both Marvel and DC started releasing a whole lot of new #1 titles for new characters, Nova being one of them. And so it was very exciting because, just to kind of answer your first question, what were my major reads? I think for the first part of my comic book collecting, I was just discovering what comic books were. I loved them. I didn't know who I had to I just bought whatever because I had no idea. One thing was just as interesting as the next. And so I didn't grapple on to any one specific title right away. Perhaps maybe the Avengers was probably, if there was, just because there was just a lot of heroes in one book. Yeah. And so I could learn about them. And then I had an uncle who loved to go to these Sunday market, swap meets. And there would inevitably be somebody who had 3 or 4 long boxes underneath the table of old radio parts or whatever. And so I would go with him all the time. And I made a whole discovery of that there were books before me, these earlier stuff, and that these characters I thought I understood had different costumes and different parts of their story. Like, oh, this is why they're talking about this thing. Here's this event. So I did a big kind of like, I needed to catch up, I just went through my comic book 101. I needed to know who these characters were and their back. So I kind of didn't collect any particular runs. As I started to gather that stuff, then I started going, okay, these are the characters I really love in these storylines. And that kind of hit me a little later. I'd say 77, 78. And that's about when Byrne and Claremont came on the picture. So honestly, that was a big game changer. But
Cockrum.
Cockrum. But I had fallen in love with Neil Adams stuff before that, and Jim Aparo, and Kirby, obviously. But Kirby, well, we'll get to him in a minute, but he was kind of like he was so omnipresent on everything at that time. At least I looked at him as kind of like the base vernacular for everything. And then everybody else was somehow springing out of it or in opposition to, or something like that.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah. He was the base.
Yeah. At that time, I've gotten a little more nuanced of a view as I've moved on, but that's what he was. So whenever I saw him, I read it, he was the king. So, okay, there's the king, and everything else. I just took a lot of what Stan said granted. But getting back to comic book stores. So before that, 7-Elevens, and we had this really cool old drugstore right across the street from the 7-Eleven, where the guy who ran it had one of those magazine things, but he just got stuff to fill the magazine stand. It wasn't like he thought in terms of like, oh, I'm going to keep on getting these titles or whatever. It was just whatever was on there. He'd get 10 of that, 20 of this or whatever. And I missed Nova number 4, which had an appearance of Thor in it. And I was apoplectic at that time, because this was going to be my starting at 1 collection.
Yeah.
And already by 4, I had failed. And then I was talking to my one comic book friend, and he's like, oh no, there's a comic book store that might have that. I'm like, oh, what? And it was 2 towns over. So we rode our bikes over there. It was,
Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in the Midwest outside of Chicago, near O'Hare Airport. So this was just a little further out in a fancy town where they had comic book stores. And the guy had it, and it had just come out about 3 weeks before, and for whatever reasons it wasn't selling big, or they only had one, and he sold it to me for $4, which was a rip-off at the time. Comic books had just turned 25 cents. And I had my lawn mowing empire. I had about 5 different people that I mowed their lawns on my street, and I would make roughly $20 a week, which is pretty good for a 12-year-old. And at that time, you could get four books for $1. So, almost all of it would go to the comic books. So the idea of taking a chunk of $4 was roughly 1, 2, 3, 4 times whatever, 4 times 4,
Huge markup.
Yeah, 16 comic books less for this thing. I did it. And that was my first run in with a comic book store. So so I think it probably colored my perception on there. I mean, I know I've talked to different people over the years on the idea of kind of going on the hunt, going to obscure places, shuffling through things. It had an archaeological appeal to it that I think I really loved. So the comic book store, it was just all there ready for you if you wanted it. They did most of the work for you. And I think there was a little part of it kind of was stealing a little bit of my thunder when I would do a find.
Yeah, and I had a very strange story that I don't think a lot of people share, which is I wasn't working at the candy store, but I would go when I knew they were going to be delivered, which was Sunday mornings. They would be bundled in wire. And eventually I would get up at 6 a.m. on Sunday, do my paper route, and then I would go to Rockland's candy store, and the guy would hand me a pair of wire cutters, and I would have first dibs.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. And it was really great. And there was one across the street. So I kind of, between the two of them, I could find stuff. Certainly there was very little continuity. You knew you were going to get Spidey. You knew you were going to get Avengers, but I'm collecting Werewolf by Night. And guess what? First appearance Moon Knight just doesn't show up.
Right.
So it just didn't have it. So it was a random catch as catch can, except for the big titles.
Right.
And that was the world. And it took years to find any sort of place that would keep long boxes, to have a look where you could, or there'd be a comic club somewhere that the local Lions Club or something, and then they'd show up with some boxes. And I guess it was like you say, a exciting discovery process, because it was sort of on the edge of being very difficult to do properly.
Oh yeah, if you had any kind of organizational, needs and desires, it was a difficult prospect at best. I do think that what was interesting, at least for me, when I think about it, I attribute a lot of my I guess people would call it more adult behavior, like earning money, delayed gratification, that being an adult behavior kind of thing. I'd mow my lawns, or I'd do whatever work was necessary. I'd find out, and I started doing some subscriptions at a
Oh,
at a
you did.
roughly at a roughly earlier age than I think I would have, just knowing who I was and what kind of I was the youngest, so I was just kind of like, where are we going? What are we doing? Okay, whatever kind of kid.
Mhm.
So the idea that I would become a little more proactive and kind of think ahead they weren't required of me inside of my family unit, because some other bigger forces of powers were already declaring what we were going to do as a group. So all of the comic books really became a place where I could define who I was a little. And that's also all the skill sets that you need to have as you get a little older. So the delayed gratification of getting subscriptions, and I did that. I specifically got my very first subscription was Avengers, because that was my entry book. It was Avengers 118. I remember we were coming back from a family vacation. My mom would buy, some cross puzzle books and Mad magazines and some comic books and stuff for the long car ride. It was a 2-day car ride. We would go out to the east, visit my family on the East Coast, and then back to the Midwest. And I remember on the drive back going, what is this? The Black Panther can see in the dark. And I thought that was the coolest thing I've ever seen. It's actually a book right now that is being marketed for sale. It's been slated. It's Avengers 118. It's the beginning between the evil eye crossover between the Defenders and the Avengers.
Right.
That was the book that,
Mhm.
yeah, that was the book that kind of went, what are these things? And I remember I went into the garbage can. My mom would throw those things out at the end of the trip because they were kind of ripped up or whatever. And I literally jumped back into the garbage can after. I was like, where are those things? It's like, oh, I threw them out. And so I went into the garbage can and I pulled them out. I rescued them. And I said, this is something I got to be a part of. So even that kind of proactive stuff, like going forward and establishing some kind of territory of my own needs and wants and stuff. So subscriptions became part of it. Avengers was one of them. But then I started doing, like, I got into the speculator market, I suppose, like the Human Fly, things like that,
Uh-huh.
like, well, this is a #1, so I should have all of those.
Right.
I think I mediated it a little later as I moved along, to stories and creators that I really cared about. I just followed. I followed more runs of creators than titles of characters themselves. Like I pursued artists for the most part. I only came aware of writers and looked at them really with Claremont. He was the first one where I started going, oh, what he writes is just as equally as interesting as what these guys are drawing. So I was most definitely drawn to the art initially. There's no doubt about that for me. And I think it's different.
And so you mentioned Aparo and who were some of the other guys?
Well, Gil Kane always. I mean, even when I was doing that, kind of going back and looking at older stuff that had come out before me, I was always drawn to his work. Just always. I had the opportunity to meet him at one of these things called a ProCon up in San Francisco. They had these. They did it for about 3 years, 4 years, and it really was quite a magical time. I think I was very lucky to have been in the right place at the right time, because a lot of these older creators, they were coming to these things and they did lectures. And Gil Kane did a whole lecture on anatomy and where he drew his inspirations from, and talked about a lot of things. So, it was like going into these seminars with these people that I completely idolized and admired, and then go and hang out with them in the bar afterwards and buy them a drink, So Gil Kane was absolutely one of my early draws. There's no doubt about it. So if you were to kind of look at, I think in general, when I was younger, I looked at the more or less graphic guys. Like Kirby was very graphic by that time. His lines were a lot thicker. It was these kind of bold strokes. They were further abstracted than some of, like Gil Kane, his anatomy, as exaggerated it was more anatomically correct. And so that married very well with me just learning to draw. Like I wanted one of the things my parents instilled in me is first learn how to do it the anatomically correct way, and then abstract it. Then you put your, but have that knowledge base of how a hand really works before you go off and abstract it. So that's where that marriage kind of probably happened there for me. I mean, it's all the normal ones from Alex Raymond on up. I mean, I love Wally Wood. I love all of those guys. Those came later to me because in general, they were a little older. And so I had to earn enough money to get their material, because what they have now, all of these collections and these backlogs and stuff like that, they didn't have that stuff when we were kids. So you had to actually get the actual books, or you saw them in fanzines, like a page here or a page there, and you went, oh, that stuff is so amazing. And then at some point, maybe later on, because comic conventions, there's ones every weekend now, or several every weekend. We had one that came through Chicago once a year, and so I remember it's like 77 going to the Chicago Con, and it was me and 3 other kids, and John Buscema took us on a little tour, told us what to, because we had come into the artists alley and was bringing our portfolios, 11-year-olds. And he's like, yeah, okay, here, this is what you should look at. And he was very kind. He took us through the hall and said, here, check these books out, check this guy out, do that with us. So I'm forever grateful to that moment as well. And those were rare because A, I wasn't growing up in New York where they lived. B, you'd had it once a year, and it was a stroke of luck that I was in that group when he was feeling like he, needed to stretch his legs, and all of those things. So those were rare, and you had to really work very hard to create those moments for yourself. There's a lot of information gathering that you had to do before you could show up to some place like that and have all those events kind of fall into place.
Yeah, it was very special.
Yeah.
So when you started drawing, what did you want to draw? What did you want to make?
So I started drawing comic books right away. Like I was 7, 8, I started drawing comic books, telling stories and drawing comic books. They were going to be my stories with the characters, Marvel characters, but then I started integrating my own characters in with Marvel characters. I spent a whole summer once I drew this big long table. It was paper cut out. It was, my kind of Justice League table or Avengers table, and then spent the entire summer creating different characters and backstories and placing them around the table. I just did that for, swim team mowing lawns and drawing my superhero crew of all of my creations.
Yeah, I never had the chops, but I still have them somewhere, the characters that I created that were all derivative of other characters.
Yeah, of course. It's 10,000 hours and then some.
Yeah. And I had my Hawkeye ripoff called The Archer.
Right. Yeah, the Phantom Avenger. Things like that. Yeah. I'm trying to think if any of them actually kind of made their way, because I have a tendency to not let go of certain things. I still draw on memories or aspects or something. I'm trying to think if there was any kind of character that found its way through the decades to actual printing. And I can't say that there was anyone in particular. maybe events, like circumstances.
Mm.
Maybe they did, I'd like to think that I thought of it. It's getting the rounds again because of the Black Widow movie, but there's a scene in Moonraker, which is a terrible movie, and it's really
Mhm.
one of the less memorable ones. But the opening James Bond sequence of him being in a airplane, and the pilot has the one parachute and jumps out, and so the
Yep.
plane's crashing, and then he jumps out and flies down and captures the. I had a sequence like that before that movie. So I'd like to think that I was already thinking of something like that. So I've since used it, but now if I use it, now everybody goes, "You're just taking it from the James Bond movies."
Right.
No. Because the other thing that growing up with three older brothers, we did a lot of filmmaking. So we did editing and filmmaking, and we did a lot of our own action movies at the time. So we spent a lot of time trying to capture stunts and whatnot on film. So we would spend a lot of time trying to think about gnarly ways to blow each other up and whatnot.
What did you do scripts for those?
Yeah, they've got more sophisticated. So my oldest brother is 6 years older. So in general, he would kind of lead the charge on some of that stuff because he was trusted with the equipment. Cost a little bit of money. So if my dad had some equipment that he was using for work, he would be maybe the one who got a chance to use the more sophisticated stuff. So, the fact that we were a little more organized probably came from that. So the scripted stuff, we would brainstorm plots like this is going to happen, that's going to happen. We had a big costume box of all the different outfits that my mom was really a very great seamstress. She was really great, actually. She made me a Captain America costume that I did wear at a costume contest at one of those Chicago cons and won. I actually won. John Byrne and Chris Claremont and Frank Miller were the judges of that particular one. Frank Miller had just started his run on Daredevil, and those guys were, a little more in the thick of the X-Men run at the time.
Right.
So it's 78, 78, around there. Maybe, 78. But anyways, I digress. We would brainstorm, come up with an idea, and then if there was any kind of scripting, it would happen just before the scene. So no sitting down and writing out the whole script beforehand. That level of organization only came way later for me.
But it's so interesting, right? Because if you look at what Kirby and what those early guys were doing, it should be said that that was storyboarding. Absolutely.
Although one thing that I would add as an addendum to that, because of course it is, it's storyboarding. It was just that there wasn't technology capable at that time to draw that stuff in or create that stuff in a 3D kind of three-dimensional film version. What I do think is being lost, and this is now me getting on my soapbox a little bit, comic books are now chasing what films are doing. And if you take a look at a lot of comic book artists, and they're fantastic. I mean, the level of art that people are creating now is just breathtaking. But the way that they're telling a story, a lot of it is storyboards. It's these long horizontal shots. So it's almost like they're thinking in terms of cinematic terms. And one of the things that I think has gotten lost a little bit, that some of the artists were earlier on that weren't necessarily thinking solely as in terms of storyboards for some other kind of dimension for it to be in there, but they were thinking in the choices that they shot, coming through someone's mouth, or just these really abstract kind of comical kind of stages or poses or framing of the storytelling were way more subjective. They were things that you wouldn't want to actually see in a film, and so there was a whole level of emotional subjective staging that is being lost more for this representational type of stuff.
Mm.
And I think that's sad. There's still a couple of artists that do that, and they've been relegated now to them. Or there's a new cartoony kind of anime influence that's coming in that is definitely a counterpoint to what I was just talking about. But even there, in their shot schedule, in their shot choices and their approaches there, it's not quite as fantastical as if you were to take a look at some of the, even Wally Wood, or if you were to take a look at somebody who was probably the most representational at the time was Alex Toth. Some of the shots and things like that just wouldn't be where a camera would ever be placed. And then you'd get even more in the Mad Magazine stuff where they would just go gonzo on it.
Mm-hmm.
And I would like to see some of that stuff coming in there, because I think comic books should be, for a lot of different reasons, should be the creative font for these adaptations for other stuff, and not the other way around. Because I think that a lot of the choices that films make have a bunch of mandates put on them, both from a commercial point of view to strictly to the physics point of view, that you're just not going to get some of the stuff that you could get inside of a comic book, where it's really just the imagination and the limitations of the artist who's presenting it. Thought that there was that's where comic books were miles ahead in forms of storytelling than almost any other medium. Closest to music, actually, just to draw it back there, I think that level of abstract stuff, that it's unfamiliar territory. So now all of a sudden you have to kind of feel your way through it, as opposed to the stuff that you maybe learned in other mediums and stuff like that. You had to kind of go, what am I looking at here? And how do I feel about it? And is it working, or isn't it? And I think that some of the really great artists, the ones that at least I found myself getting more and more drawn to as I got a little older, held on to that stuff. Somebody who does that is Greg Capullo. He still does an awful lot of that stuff in the Spawn runs. He has a level of risk that he'll take with what is decidedly macho material, and finding some ways to get goofy and get really just other notes, other kinds of emotional places, realms to be in a story, because I think a good story should have some of those things too. It's also what makes it unique, and it breaks out of a formula.
I made an early connection because the two worlds were happening for me simultaneously, but in my early adolescence, I made a connection between listening to progressive rock and reading comic books.
It's a big connection between those two. That's a huge connection. Well, go on. I want to hear your side here.
Well, just that, and this ties into something I wanted to ask you about, which is, of course, album covers,
Mm-hmm.
and how important they were to us becoming ensconced in a world that was the visual representation of that sonic element of the music. Let's go right to Roger Dean and the Yes album covers.
Oh, sure.
But, all of that stuff where, a Brain Salad Surgery, where, you could open change the look of the cover by opening it up, or any gatefold album like Tales from Topographic Oceans, where you could become sort of a book, and it's I
remember flipping through Robin Trower's Journey to the Center of the Earth and all the booklets inside, and just kind of going through it. Or Uriah Heep had really cool covers too.
Right.
Their Magician's Birthday, the interior on that was always pretty psychedelic. Yeah.
That's another Roger Dean, and so Demons and Wizards, Uriah Heep.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And so somebody is paying attention. Yep. And that became the soundtrack for reading those books. And I just wondered if that was something that was similar for you.
Well, definitely. That's so one of the things that I've been talking to, because I do a class and I do work with some younger artists, and I think that the style is great, and it's important to have a style. It means your voice and all that stuff. But I think, at least from a comic book point perspective, and really also from a graphic arts perspective, it's important to really respect the story. That has to be first and foremost. If people don't get what the story is, or where it's coming from, or the mood or the tone, the rest of it is kind of is moot, or it combats it, or it takes people a longer time. So you have to be very specific in some of your choices right away, about the the kind of the things that you need to connote right away, that you need to get in there. And that's a graphic kind of point of view, is cut to the short. And I also think that's an animation point of view too. It's a take away detail until it's just the slight armature that sells everything that you need to sell. Then you can add on if you need to. But and it's like poetry that way too, I think. And it's all of the exploration is done by the artist, and then the final product is the findings. These are my findings. These are the headlines that you're going to get. And I think that that's what the great album covers did for me, is it kind of taught me those things. It's like very clear, boom, boom, boom. These are the things you need to know, because I'm going to do, and then the music's going to do a lot more of the work. It's going to fill in a lot of those things. It's going to imbue it with all of the stuff that it because you made your correct choices. You made the correct choices. And if it felt like if something didn't quite work, like, I don't know, I'm even trying to think of, like, as much as that album, the album's great, that Black Sabbath cover, I've never quite understood the Black Sabbath Paranoid, the kind of multi-featured of the guy with the sword. In the spandex, I never quite got it. It was always a little off-putting to me. There was but not off-putting in a bad way. It's just like there was some kind of cognitive dissonance that was happening there for me, because I'd hear this kind of hardcore, this kind of dark tones and all of this stuff, and then you'd see that guy in the yellow spandex, and you're like, there's something that's not quite married there. And I wonder if they didn't have a missed opportunity, or if there was something I was missing. So sometimes when it's wrong, it equally informs you too, about at least what I was talking about.
But the first Sabbath cover, I think.
Oh yeah. Yes. Yeah. You could have just had a black cover. It would have been fine. It would have been totally fine. Some of them. And then there were other ones, like, you look at Sgt. Pepper's and all of the like little doodads, and you could just study every little tiny detail. But that's also the music, right? I mean, it wasn't an eclectic piece of stuff. So I mean, that's what that was part of the philosophy behind it, is like there's little bits and pieces. This is a smorgasbord of a lot of ideas. So let the art be that way too.
And the Zappa covers were important to
Absolutely.
that too, because he was a graphic artist.
Mm-hmm.
He assembled all that shit. And early when I started this podcast, I interviewed Don Preston, who was the keyboardist in the original Mothers of Invention. And he showed me that Zappa knew as early as 67, I want to say, we're only in it for the money, to advertise in Doctor Strange. And there are ads of Zappa albums in Marvel comic books in Doctor Strange. He had made that connection because he was a visual artist, in addition, visual thinker, musician.
That's really interesting. I mean, I know that Doctor Strange had an audience that was a college crowd audience too, that it was an older audience at the time, which is so interesting from a different perspective. If you talk about Steve Ditko, and really honestly, the principal architect of that kind of visual kind of psychedelic stuff, he was such a straight edge. There was no drugs involved in his, but his art in general, he's also one of the greats. I mean, he's one of the greats, but his stuff has best I can turn. I mean, it's not the right word, or it's the word meant in its in its truest sense, not in the way that it gets used, but there's a perversion, and I don't mean it in a sexual way. I mean it in some kind of unnatural kind of way, just the hands and stuff like that. There's a darkness in his stuff.
I was going to use a similar word.
Yeah, I know.
Subversive.
Subversive, sure, it is. It's subversive, but he, his political views and whatnot, the whole kind of objectivism kind of thing. But I wonder if he didn't have some mental issues that didn't also inform his art. And issues, bad or good, it was good for us, but I wonder for him, as far as an individual. Just always wondered that, because there's an otherworldliness to even his most normal stuff that is just so unique, so different, and elusive. And that elusiveness I have always thought of as something that the reason it's elusive is because I don't have the mental capacity to really fully understand where it's coming from. I can copy it, I can ape it, but to generate it is a very different thing. And he did that. I mean, that's really where the manifestation of his ability was, in that Doctor Strange stuff. It's where it just all found its way there. And it just had a level that I know that everybody who ever saw it, they went, well, that's what it's like, trip. Whether or not they knew whether or not they had done it, or not. He had a way of doing that. So that and The Hobbit, right? Those were the two big college in the late 60s. Those were the two big cultural touchstones for a lot of the kind of hippie cultural movement, from the fantasy point of view.
Mm-hmm. And I always felt as though Ditko had, even if you go back to his more horror stuff, now this stuff is all available in collections, and, his non-superhero stuff, there was a gothic quality to it.
There's a mercilessness. If in that, if you mean by gothic, what are the terms that you would use to define gothic? What kind of, when you say
dark, brooding, sort of, I want to say gritty, and a kind of malevolent atmosphere. There's a look in his characters' faces where he indicated terror in a way that I had not seen before. So I found some of that stuff disturbing. I mean, I kind of still do.
Oh, I do too, but I mean, it's also attractive in another way. It's that drawing in. I mean, I think it's that elusive quality for me. It's both unnerving, and I'm also trying to figure out what it is I'm looking at in some ways. And I think that goes right down to his line qualities, the way that certain things have a droop or a shape that they're slightly more oblong, or, and then on top of it are some of his choices of, like, why is the fingers there and doing this or whatever. Those are even kind of secondary to the first stuff, and that's just his shape language that he operates in and stuff like that. Conjures up all those things. There is the best word. Yeah, I mean, dark. There's I don't know, there's just a disconnect too in it that's so incredibly attractive about, he draws these people in hats and stuff, and I'm like, yeah, no, that's great. That's a guy in a hat, here's drinking a coffee cup or whatever. And then I'll put these odd patterns on it. And you're like, all of a sudden it just went from, okay, I know what I'm looking to, what the hell am I looking at here? And things like that. They're just so great. It was just natural. It was just his. I think a lot of these guys, maybe also people like Kirby too, maybe they didn't want to, or weren't allowed in, or didn't have what was considered the appropriate skill levels or whatever to get into graphic arts, but they brought a whole new kind of level of graphic arts. If you look at Kirby's stuff and you look at mid-century modern stuff, there's a big marriage between some of those things, some of the shapes and the ovals and stuff like that. It's just his interpretation of machinery that really gets super graphic, where all of a sudden, things that would look like tubes and wiring and motherboards, he's somehow made them feel more ornamental than, this kind of, more representational. It's just like he separated it up, and they're like little boxes, and there's a circle in that box, and then there's a wire that comes out. But if you look at the general shapes of stuff, I think he was deeply influenced by like Sarnen, who did the St. Louis Arch.
Mm.
If you look at any of his kind of design work and things like that, it all feels very Kirby in its initial shape. But then Kirby had that wood block kind of thing that he would put on top of it, and then it would become Kirby. But if there was some kind of like thing that he was looking at and going, I'm going to try and draw that into my books, and then it went through his filter, I think that there's a real connection there. Well, and with some of the other kind of mid-century modern kind of futurist designers who were working at the time. But I always tried to figure out where Ditko was pulling his stuff. And to be honest, I have yet to find out where his influences are. I can find other people's influences. I do enough of that. I start digging and going, okay, where did you come in? And I kind of find out what they listened to and what they liked. And I can kind of see some kind of, at the very least, some connections. But I have yet to find for Ditko stuff, and I have looked. So
Yeah.
somebody out there has got one, please send it my way.
Yeah, it's unique, and he was an enigma, wasn't he?
Yeah, his whole thing. I mean, really down to the way he lived too. Evidently, he was really quite nice in person. I've always imagined him to be kind of a bit of a recluse and not wanting to talk, but that wasn't the case. He would talk one-on-one. He just didn't want to deal with any of the kind of the fandom-ish aspects of the stuff. Which led me to wonder if he didn't have, at least he had anxieties, right? At the very least, he had social anxieties. And I also wonder if just talking in big groups was probably a little more problematic for him than maybe some other people.
He strikes me like, as some musicians do, as being a little spectrum-y,
Yeah, I think you're right. I think in general, if you're going to be creative, you're going to find a lot of people a little spectrum-y. Let's be honest. What the other thing is when you were talking about prog rock and the connection to art and graphic art, the graphics and comics and stuff, which there is. Where I live right next to JPL, Jet Propulsion Laboratory, out near Pasadena, La Cañada. Most of my friends are rocket scientists or work on this stuff. Talk about another spectrum-y group. And there is another whole connection between comic books and their work. A lot of them are all super big comic fans when they were kids. What they chose to do was go, how do I turn that tricorder into something real? That's, that was their journey from that stuff. But it's still kind of a pool of imagination where there was some commonality. They could draw on it, and then they found a way to interpret that and use it in their pursuits. But there's
How many NASA scientists have said, oh yeah, Star Trek?
Yeah, absolutely. But also, I mean, the knowledge of, like, I can have some pretty in-depth conversations with some of these guys about runs and comic books like that. They're just huge. They're just huge comic guys. And then all of a sudden, then they can talk about the Planck theories and quantum space and all of this other stuff on top of it. They took all of that stuff and went, how can I find a negative zone in reality here?
Right. They're so in love with it as a kid that they pursue it. Yeah. I mean, it's also interesting to me when we talk about the prog rock connection, that from time to time, I'll go to Artist Alley at whatever con it might be. And I had a wonderful experience with Rich Buckler, who was one of my favorite guys back in the day. He was on FF at that time when I was collecting. He created Deathlock. He was kind of an important post Kirby figure to be brought onto the bullpen, right?
Right.
So I said to him, and I'll do this all the time. I'll say, what did you listen to when you were drawing? Did you have background music on? What was the kind of stuff that you were into? Rich Buckler, without batting an eyelash, goes, oh, prog rock, Emerson, Lake and Palmer. Yes. You know, and that fascinated me, because then when I did the Kirby Requiem album, I was always asking everyone that I contacted, like Mark Evanier, what music did Jack Kirby listen to? And when he worked, and he said he did, and he had the TV on, and the TV kept him company, and he didn't listen to music. So did you listen to music while you were drawing when you started out?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I would say that the music that kind of kept me focused, because I needed stuff that would focus me, in general, was a lot more muscular. It was a lot of punk. I listened to a lot of punk, fast stuff that just kind of starting from, from the most traditional stuff, the Ramones and the Clash and all of that stuff. But, then it got into Wire, and then Wire got into prog rock for me. Oddly enough, Wire was one of those crossovers that kind of got for me. Having three older brothers, my second oldest, prog rock all the way, all the Robin Trower, all the Uriah Heep. I grew up with all of that stuff in there. When I just aging for where I was as far as it went, new wave, it kind of kicked, but then there was also the whole New York City punk underground stuff, and that became mine. So, and I did find that it was really useful for kind of closing off the sound out there, and also just creating an envelope for me to work inside of. So that's where I started. But honestly, now I'm listening to, but right now I'm going through, I really like the Go-Go Penguin and Moondog, just kind of going through a whole bunch of just more experimental stuff. So.
Oh, you mean the older Moondog stuff?
Yeah, the older Moondog stuff. So, and so that's soundscape stuff in a lot of ways, some of it, and some of it's also some really, really interesting kind of choral music too. So honestly, it depends on the material I'm working on, and if there is a kind of an emotional state that I would like to find myself in when working on that stuff, I'll let the music inform that stuff. It becomes a little bit of the soundtrack for the thing. If I'm drawing something, and I got to create a world and stuff, I would also think in terms of the soundtrack. What's going to be there. So I do actually kind of curate my stuff that way. Not to any kind of degree of like, I'm going to listen to this to draw that thing. I find it as I'm listening to stuff and go, you know what, this stuff is really actually informing my work in a way, or putting me in the right mental state, for me to kind of think about the things that I think are important to think about while I'm drawing here. So, but initially it was to push the world away. So punk was great for that. And then just kind of moving through stuff after that.
Was ambient stuff in there?
That came later because I was also really heavily into lyrics for a big time. And so ambient stuff and really kind of more just pure music stuff, that came a little later. And really, honestly, I went through a big Thelonious Monk. I went through a big jazz phase, going in there and really discovering, music that didn't have lyrics that were just as equally as informative about things, but that came a little later. Like much like my comic book experience, I kind of came with what was in front of me at the moment, got interested, and then just started branching out after that. You know? But I do like to keep moving. What I don't do is I don't really kind of sit in one area too long. I think I really like to keep moving. So there might be things that I pick up along the way that I really love that stay with me. But in general, if I'm not trying to listen to new stuff or trying to discover, one of the best things about taking a little break and working and doing a lot more writing, which was kind of where my main focus has been for the past couple of years, because everybody can write a letter. Writing a story and constructing it and getting very specific, like I was talking about with lines and animation and stuff like that, there's a whole craft that you have to learn. And the only way you do it is by focusing on it, spending some time doing it, and working with people who know how to do it better than you do already, and just kind of soaking up what you can. While I've been in that, I've allowed myself the time inside of my art, because I try to do a little bit every day. I try and draw a little bit every day. I try and play every day, and I try and write every day. It's kind of my regime. But while I'm really focusing on the craft of writing, I will break away from what I normally do with art and try experimenting with different tools. And in doing so, I discover whole new approaches, things that I wouldn't have done, especially if I was doing a monthly book. There's a thing about a monthly book that it does get to a point where you're building up a skill set to also hit a deadline.
Yeah.
And so you're not doing a whole lot of exploring, even though the books and the stories and the narratives force you to think outside of certain boxes, which was so great about comic books, especially if you're working with people who are also equally exploring that way. But what I'm talking about is not being results oriented, simply just exploring and making discoveries and stuff like that. And so I've had a lot of that. Right now, an opportunity with art. I've just tried different brushes and different tools, and I'm finding new techniques and things like that. So it's very exciting. So in a couple of months, I'm going to start in on a new book, but it will be with the things I've been learning over the past couple of years, and the ability to give myself the opportunity to kind of stop going to a kind of results-oriented place for a little while. And any one of these things has really been a gift that I try to give myself as much as possible, because there's always new stuff to learn, new approaches to learn. And if you're not a constant student, I personally think then, what's the point? I want to be a constant student. So I am that way also with what I listen to.
I think you have to be, otherwise you get stuck. And also, you listen to I certainly have this thing where, I've listened to stuff enough that I can hear it right now.
Yeah.
Like, do I need to listen to Sgt. Pepper's? I can listen to it right now.
That's right.
So, it's not like I'm going to have, unless I'm going to try some other sort of surround mix or something like that, those are all in there, but I have to catch up on all this stuff I haven't heard.
Yeah.
And I need to get more Eno, and I need to, discover Harold Budd more. And I need to get into, a lot of these guys that I was deficient in.
Right.
And then that, of course, bastes you and sort of, imbues you with other perspectives on what does that mean to me?
That's right.
How's that going to synthesize inside me? Like a different sense of space. I mean, as I've gotten older and you've heard my stuff over 20 years. I mean, I'm writing slow music now. I'm writing long, slow,
got some
bigger
nice space
ideas.
some volume inside of it, some space inside of it. It allows people to kind of drift along with in a way that is really kind of inclusive in a way that I think
And also the sense of place
mm-hmm.
has become more important to me. Scene, atmosphere, and not as much about notes flying around to indicate extreme velocity and action and violence. You become a little bit less violent in your work as you have your kids and start to realize, oh, there's other ways of responding to the world.
I always used to think that violence was the most impactful type of stuff, like really grab them by the throat. And even my art would be super like that. It's just like, wow, pizzazz, boom, 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 and realizing when I was going back to talking about story, if you can honor the intent and be very specific about it and as close as you can, man, talk about impact. Talk about, I mean, that's the kind of stuff that sticks in people's heads for the rest of their lives. That isn't like a momentary, like unwrapping a piece of candy and eating it, you know.
Right.
This is something that sits for a long time.
And it's big, you know, it's also big to important to be dynamic.
Yeah,
And
of
that,
course.
you know, if it's like, the reason I like Meshuggah, my favorite metal band, is because they'll bring it down to one guitar and they'll just have some arpeggios floating. They're not going to hit you over the head for the entire duration of a piece of music, so that the impact has impact.
Yeah.
Because it shows a range, a scale is a scale of 1 to 10, rather than everything's at 11. And to me, it has become all about contrast. Like, you can't have consonance without dissonance. You can't have light without dark. You can't have what you want unless you want to paint just in black. And then, of course, surprise. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that surprise, you know, when you talk about in contrast, I think that that's it, right? It's got to be the right surprise, you know, because that's the other thing is, you know, people are, there's a lot of stuff out there. People are pretty well informed by this stuff. So to catch somebody by surprise and it to be a successful surprise, not like you didn't set this up and now I'm giving you a surprise that doesn't work at all here, you know, there's a lot of attempts at that. But I mean, ones where you're like, you went there. Wow. That is fantastic. I did not see that coming. You know, talk about, I have nothing but gratitude when people do that to me. It's nothing but gratitude. So if I can try and find it myself, boom, that's a constant hunt for me. And that is about being dynamic. Like you said, you need to be nimble. You need to have a lot of different places that you can draw on. I mean, one of the things that we do with our animation, we work with about 50 different writers, but a lot of the writers that we brought in don't work in animation or hadn't started in animation. So we can teach you the specifics that you need to know about, you know, how to do this and how to do that for an animated thing. I want you to bring in what your experience in your life and the things that you saw, because in this particular medium, you can easily get hooked into the 12 stories that everybody tells. The minute somebody starts going, hey, we're going to do one where everybody shrinks down into little babies, or we're going to go inside a person's body, or, you know, like it's like, there's like so many of these. It's like, okay, the minute you're there, just move on, because this project's dead, or I'm dead if I'm letting this stuff go through. Somebody else needs to come in and do it. And the way that you do that is because you're bringing in a level of dynamism, because people have different interests and there are different things that they're bringing in. And I think that you got to do that for yourself. You've got to be able to draw on a lot of stuff. I'll make a reference in a story, or in a story meeting. I'll make a reference to something in vaudeville, because I know that shit really well, especially in cartoons. If you don't know vaudeville, then you're working in a major deficit. You know,
that's really interesting. Yeah, it's true.
Slapstick. I mean, that's the reason all that early Looney Tunes worked, is those guys were deeply ensconced in that stuff. They knew all the pratfalls, all the different kinds of physical comedy, and that's why it was second language to them. Everybody now works in irony, you know, an irony and this kind of like level of like, oh, isn't, you know, this like observing detachment, you know, and it can be funny, but, you know, after
a lot of sarcasm too.
Yeah, just a lot of sarcasm. So
snarky.
Yeah, so there's nothing physical or moving in it, you know, that way. And when you have animation, which is a visual medium, folks, or part of it is, you're denying a whole aspect of it. You think in terms of jokes. You think in those terms. You don't think in terms of space, where you are, what's happening. Wouldn't it be funny if it's more of an eye movement here than even a line, and things like that? There's so many different ways you can come at some issue. And if you aren't moving like that, I think you're doing yourself a disservice. And you're doing your audience a disservice.
And you know, you'd be someone that could speak to this, which is the idea of comedy, musical visual timing?
So one of the things that I consider one of my kind of secret weapons is I went to school for theater. I actually did a lot of improvisation and acting improvisation with people. So, that is as close to my rap battling I've ever done. But when you're working with people who are very sharp and stuff, and you have to stay on your toe, and you are trying to keep the audience, because that stuff can really kind of drift very quickly. Unscripted stuff can get really into some miasma pretty quickly. You know this quite well, especially if you're sitting there doing some free form stuff and people are playing off of each other. You can find yourself in some areas that you want to get out of pronto.
You better focus if you're going to go open. Yep.
Yeah. And so I think that has really informed me in a way. Also, there's also just physical comedy, just being able to know your body in space, has informed a lot of my drawing. It was straight down to the dynamism and the straight up superhero stuff, the kind of like swinging and things like that. One of the things I think I kind of pride myself on is if anybody's going to say anything about my stuff, it's dynamic. It most definitely feels like it flows and moves, and that's something that I've always attributed to also trying to communicate and interact with people physically through a physical space. And that's what acting had done. I suppose you could get that as if you were a dancer. I didn't have any level of body control like that, but with those kind of things, that's pure poetry of motion, using physical motion. But yeah, I think that kind of stuff draws. Absolutely. You draw on it, your knowledge base of that, and you synthesize it, and form it, and it forms all your choices moving forward.
I always thought Gene Colan might have been a good dancer.
I think he might very well have. There is a level, some of his stuff, because boy, I've seen some earlier pencils just recently of some of his Dracula stuff.
Mm.
And what was so interesting to me, and this actually started to alter maybe my view of him, is because one of the things that I've always felt like with his art, they would often be, because everything's kind of moving in a certain direction and stuff like that. And the way that he would, or the inkers who would ink, a lot of stuff would kind of feather off. Like there was always this kind of dream haze around some aspect of the art, and it would inform. It's saying it's coming from this place and it's going to that place, it always gave you that kind of thing. And I always thought, wow, that, and even in his line work where he would choose to not close a line, like he would come in and it would be more detailed here, but everything else here would be maybe just a touch looser,
Do you think that was lighting for him? Because I always thought of him as he lit every panel.
So looking at his pencils, some pencils I had never seen before, and seeing that his cross hatching and whatnot was getting more and more minuscule and tight, that I think a lot of inkers just couldn't do that. And so that's what would create that kind of a cloud feeling. And that he really was he was a master lighter of his stuff. That's really what one of his big strengths is that, he would keep stuff less defined on where it was its brightest, because this is where, the light was kind of hitting, bouncing back, and, you weren't kind of seeing, you weren't kind of defining the edges. But he had gotten to a point where his pencils were just so fine. You could see that he had finished that stuff, and said, these are where the lines are. But I think a lot of guys just couldn't follow his lead on some of that stuff. It was actually a big revelation, at least on those pages. So maybe it was just on those pages. I don't know. I'd have to take a look,
Well, those were Palmer inks?
Tom did a lot of those, but he didn't ink everything on his. And I'm trying to think of, I don't know who actually wound up inking these pages, because I had never seen these pages before, so.
I don't know if I ever told you this, Duncan, but I had a wonderful experience with Gene Colan where in his last years, he was invited to a local high school comic club gathering. in, 2 towns over. And he showed up and he did a shell head for my son, wouldn't take, a dollar for, wouldn't take any money for it. And I said to him, your horror stuff and your shadow stuff and your Dracula run and even, I think he did Dracula Frankenstein, right? At a certain point. Yeah.
And Daredevil. That's a big one.
Well, of course. I mean, and all of the,
you were saying is horror
Doctor
stuff.
Strange, but just say I was mentioning those, and he told me this story, which I could relate to because I had a similar experience with a different film. But he said when he was 5 years old, the first Frankenstein came out, and his father took him to see Frankenstein when he was 5,
mm-hmm.
and he couldn't sleep for a month after that. It freaked him out so bad. And I told him my Planet of the Apes story, which was, that my mom thought it was a nature documentary. So let's go see the Planet of the Apes with our 5-year-old Gregg. And I heard Goldsmith's Alien soundtrack, and I saw the desperation, and I saw and it was so traumatic to me that to this moment, I think I'm just dealing with Planet of the Apes soundtrack at least.
I think I being the youngest, I was exposed to material that probably, my parents, I actually remember seeing Fantastic Voyage when I was 2 and them drawing on the guy's head. I still have this, before they're going to shoot him, with the hypodermic needle and all of that stuff. And what is this? And then you're inside this body and this whole kind of body horror thing. I think he just I was 2 and I have memories of it. So,
right.
Seeing Dog Day Afternoon, Peckinpah's Dog Day Afternoon and things like that. It's like, I look at my parents, I'm like, what were you thinking? It's like, well, what, we're going to give a babysitter for you?
Yeah. And of course, my dad was an artist. My dad was a art teacher, art historian, art lover, but a film buff. Mm-hmm. So I'm seeing the Fellini stuff before I'm double digits, and I'm seeing Juliet of the Spirits, and I'm terrified by some of these dream images. I think all of that stuff is the most important early stuff because you're kind of dealing with that for the rest of your life. You're synthesizing it.
I think it most definitely some of those important early questions, when you start having these things and you're trying to figure them out and you've got this kind of framework of these more kind of slightly amorphic kind of, they aren't super defined, or if they are, they're so specifically, impactful, like Frankenstein. I mean, I can recall the first time I saw that too. I mean, just all of the lighting and the German expressionism that found its way into it, which I'm a big fan of all of that kind of Gothic German expressionist because of this kind of nightmarish kind of deco kind of
Bauhaus.
Super lighting kind of thing. It's just, I mean, it's so now I'm just blanking on his name, the famous Chiaroscuro. Oh man, the guy painter who does super. I mean, he's a Renaissance painter. Oh, well, I'll remember it at 12 o'clock tonight. It'll appear back in my head. All of his stuff is just a super bright light on one side and then, super dark on the other thing. All of that kind of, that's really impactful stuff. It's very dramatic.
And the sets on Bride of Frankenstein.
Oh yeah. No, they're beautiful. They're pieces of art. Pop art, but art on top of it too.
And it's remarkable to think about that was happening in that time period.
Yeah, when they had such a lever of control to what they were going to and what they weren't going to produce to get these kind of things sneak through. I have an interesting story about that as far as when it comes to working in the commercial art fields. I won't say the title. Let's just say that the show itself is a cultural phenomenon and everybody loves it, and old and young alike, and it's very quotable. All of the characters and everything in there. There isn't an audience demographic that doesn't have an opinion, a favorable opinion of this particular brand. But I was at a meeting with one of the executives who was in charge of the studio at the time, and they had a poster hanging in the back of this particular brand. And we were talking about, and he was very concerned about certain demographics and certain things that, of how to position a project and stuff like that. And I asked him, I go, well, I got to tell you, all the things you're talking about, the poster you have hanging on the wall doesn't do any of that. And it was a success. And he said with a straight face, he goes, if I was working here at that time, they would never have been up, blah, blah, blah.
Wow.
And I thought to myself, that's all I needed to hear. I was like, thanks. Okay, goodbye. But he was so into his theories and schematics and things like that. So talking to guys who actually were responsible for this project later on, I kind of conveyed that story. And they're like, we were just left alone. We were left in a little corner to work on it, and nobody came and told us what to do or anything like that because they didn't think it was going to turn into anything one way or another. We were just completely left alone to do it and follow our instincts, and boom. So I wonder if that isn't a similar circumstance with those Frankenstein ones. One of the big things as far as film goes, you'll notice, I think horror in of itself, and this was the template that got set. You can screw with narrative, you can screw with genres. I mean, as long as it's horrific or scary, it's going to bring in a certain kind of audience that wants to be thrilled that way. But you can topics, things like that. Horror is a real place as far as film goes where you can have innovation. It can be very avant-garde in its approach that isn't typical of what else is happening at the time, because and I think this is where it relates to comic books, because it's considered a subgenre. It's kind of considered a little offshoot. So you get a lot of experimentation, you get a lot of creativity, you get a lot of artists being left alone.
That's why I bring metal into the picture, because these bands that don't give a fuck, that have whatever audience they have free reign to do what they want. And the progressive metal movement right now, to me, is where a lot of the most creative stuff is happening. Now, you can feel how you feel about it in terms of volume or sonics or whatever it is. And there's a definite male element to it, masculine thing, but not always. And so you kind of it goes back to the most intense visuals of these films like Planet of the Apes or 2001 or Frankenstein, or that it has a mission to explore a depth of the psyche, if you will, that is going to be somewhat uncomfortable. But there's a reason for that mission, which is that we're trying to dig out some of that stuff and try to put it out there so that it's not in here harming us.
Oh, absolutely. From the artist's point of view, completely agree. From an audience point of view, it gets back to what you were talking about earlier about dynamism and a surprise. I think, like I was saying, the fact that, if you're in a kind of in a world where you expect all of these kind of all movies or all music to kind of be this, all of a sudden when somebody comes along that is not meeting those expectations and meeting something else, that in of itself to me is super exciting. And I think to a lot of people, and it gets often rewarded, but it seems to, there's a risk, quote unquote, financial risk that can be involved in that stuff. So a lot of these are these subgenres where there isn't a whole lot of money flying around,
And maybe there will be, you know, at some point, because
when it becomes popular, yeah.
yeah,
Sure.
yeah. And
Yeah.
then you have to decide whether it's still cutting edge or not.
That's right.
But the thing of it is for me, and I like to say this, and I'm happy to say it to you, but for me, the great art exists outside of its time. It reflects its time perhaps for that moment, but then it has a resonance that doesn't have to do with time.
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. No, and you know, and I don't know if I could ever put any kind of, I can pick out, you know, pieces that feel that way to me. Like there's some things when you see it, it feels incredibly familiar and also brand new all at the exact same time. It's, you know, something like, you know, there are certain groups and bands that they all of a sudden, when you hear it, you go, oh my God, they are expressing a voice or a movement or a group of people that I know that I've never heard that group of people or that movement or that time introduced before. And that's exciting in of itself. But then if the group has some substance and whatnot, you'll realize what they're also capturing is, well, this group, the reason that it hadn't ever been, you know, represented before or hadn't been represented this time is because of these social dynamics or whatever. And so you're getting that. That's the next level. And then on top of it, they're human, and this is part of the human experience, and that's the deep reservoir, right? That's the one. That's the timeless reservoir that that will carry on long after that. If it's being true, if ultimately the discovery is a reminding yourself of if the art can remind you that you're human and that you've done all of these things and that you're part of a continuum. And I think that that's, you know, that's kind of a place that I think I would always strive to be, is like just to help people, remind them that we're all in it and that you're in it, you know, and all of the things that you've ever done here, I'm kind of just mirroring you a little bit here for you as part of it, I think, at least for me. And I think that that in of itself can be very on guard because we stray so far away from those feelings an awful lot.
Right. So when you go there, you know, you're committing in a way that is kind of courageous.
It's scary because, you know what, honestly, you're also bearing everything. You know, if you're going for it, it can be a scary thing. If you're kind of going for what you think is going to win, like the easy cheer or the easy applause, I think I know enough now. I know where I could kind of, you know, pop a Trump joke in there if I wanted to get a certain group going, or if I wanted to, you know, get another group stirred up. I know how to toss red meat just as like anybody else, but that's cheap and it's not real, and it's the candy we were talking about earlier, you know, just too much pizzazz up front, no depth. Yeah. And on that timeless note with the Kirby thing going, I just wanted to tell you, sorry, I had gone to visit his grave on Father's Day. So this is my, I just needed to. I knew where he was buried, and I knew that he was buried. And I've lived in LA for now, what, 30 odd years, never went there to go pay my respects, but I just wanted to on this day, just because I had been doing a lot of thinking about him recently, because quite frankly, we're in a boom of all of his thoughts right now, and all of that, and all of the things that he brought to it. Is it's now a worldwide conversation. It is not just like a little small clubhouse conversation.
You mean like the way it was back in 2001 when we met?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It was still there. I mean, it's a major transformation for where it is from 2001 to where we are, as far as people's understanding and also appreciation of. Like, I think people are genuinely moved by these stories. It's not just the pizzazz and the excitement and the costumes and all, and they are all super cool. But I do think that the relevancy of some of these stories, some of the things that moved us, and there's like, I'm just so glad other people are, you know, I'm not just some kind of nerd sitting in a corner here, that other people get moved by this stuff too, and that they're finding that level of excitement. It's okay. At first I had kind of an ownership thing. It's like, that's mine, not yours. You know, I know about this and you did. I let that go pretty quickly, you know, once I just kind of realized that I didn't own any of it anyways. This guy did. And I wanted to go visit him and say thank you. This was him, and I appreciate seeing other people enjoy it and reminding me that he did that stuff for me. I needed to just send my gratitude as best I could, for that moment, because honestly, we are in a boom right now of doing this stuff. You can sit in a room and not know at all what your effect is. It's just stuff, you're putting stuff on a piece of paper, and then maybe you get a couple of Twitter reviews or something like that, but you don't really understand if you're having any kind of, and you're craving that interaction ultimately. In some way you are, so the idea that he's having such a major effect, and that people are having conversations about geopolitical events using his characters to and also social events, use his characters to discuss this stuff. And these are things that, even with the Falcon and Winter Soldier TV show, which I thought was great, it really touched on a lot of socio-political stuff that's happening in a really meaningful way. All of that stuff had been already at least discussed, and maybe not as succinctly and maybe not as well-timed, but a lot of that stuff has already been kind of discussed in some kind of way. And to see other people have that, and it being able to help people have conversations about this stuff in a non-screamy kind of way, if you find yourself falling on different sides of some kind of topic, I think it's really fantastic, and we owe him for that. And the best you can do is say thank you and try and pass it on, and make sure that people know that where it came from.
And in 2001, when we met at that party at your house, I often tell the story that you couldn't believe that I was going to write music inspired by Jack Kirby's art.
And by the way, captured it magnificently. I got to give you some props. I really thought that, when you say what did I listen to? I listened to that for a good portion of time, just on replay.
Really?
Yeah. There were so many aspects in the sonic world that you were capturing that I thought had some of that mid-century kind of. It was there was some of the sci-fi elements in there, especially with some of the distortion and things like that was coming through. But also, really, honestly, when you were working a lot on your on the xylophone and all of that, all of those kind of things, that's just had a Tropicana underpinning, but it wasn't. It was its own thing. It was modern. It was also of the time, but it just worked. I thought it worked great. So people who haven't heard it, they should really go out and get it.
Well, it's funny because it's become a thing within my career that people know, that they gravitate to. It's the 20th anniversary of that album coming out. And 20 years ago, I don't think that many people, and you'll recall easily that was during the fight for his rights.
Yeah.
For him, but he was not getting recognized and not getting the royalties. There wasn't a deal with the estate. There wasn't any of this stuff.
Yeah.
And just to tell people this story, because you're such a big part of it, you helped gather the forces. When I said, I want to do this for Jack, you said, I can help you. And you got me Stan Lee, because you were working with Stan around that time for his first website?
It was Stanley Media, which turned into an ill-fated but I was working with Stan. I was working with him every day, very closely.
You were working with Stan. Stan, you told everybody, do this for Jack, because there wasn't anything like that. There hasn't really been since.
No.
But just the idea of I'm going to put it on my sleeve and I'm going to say, this is comic book geekery in a musical setting. And you got me Stan Lee to write a liner note, no questions asked about money. Jim Steranko, no questions asked. Although I'll tell you that story in a second. Mark Evanier, Kirby's assistant. Steve Gerber, the late,
who was also working at Stan Lee at the time.
And he was working at Stan Lee. And he had created Howard the Duck and wrote The Defenders and so many things. And I remember that you even went to Paul at DC and said, license this guy some of this artwork. And you coached me and said, maybe don't go for the superhero imagery, which I didn't. You know, I went for characters and characterization, the big, massive scenes, the 2-page spreads. Paul Levitz said, okay, what do you want to use? Fax me the pages you want. And I had those black and white collections, you know, and you helped me find a guy to colorize the black and white stuff, Eric Eng Wong, shout out to Eric. But I thought you would appreciate this story, which was everybody automatically said, yes, I will contribute. I'll write something about Jack. This is a good occasion. Steranko, however, if you know Steranko.
Yeah, I don't know the story, but I know Steranko. So
if you know Steranko out there, you fans who know the man and met him and spoken with him, it's a hard nut. So, and a musical background, guitarist, in addition to all the other great stuff he's done, scape artist. And he had gotten a letter from me as you hooked me up with Steranko. And I get a phone call out of the blue. Hello, Gregg Bendian? Yes, Steranko. Oh my God, hi, Mr. Steranko. Thank you so much for calling. I know about your project. I want you to know that I support it, but I'm not going to do anything until I hear the music. Can you send me the music? Of course, I'll send you the roughs right now. So I sent him the roughs. Of course, everything's through the post, you know, at that point. Gregg Bendian, Steranko, I listened to your project and I approve. I will write something for you. And it's one of the most amazing liner notes of all time. In fact, as a tribute, I want to read it to everyone because it's so fucking tight, you know? Okay. Jack Kirby, he is so intimately identified with comics that merely mentioning his name elicits a shockwave of imagery immersed in mythic dimensions, synthesized in a half-century of creative fire and consecrated in the crucible of universal media success. He was the most influential talent ever spawned by the comic book form and status that he will endure through the next millennium because of the hundreds of seminal characters he forged during the 4-color evolution and the thousands of pages he generated to bring them dynamically to life. Where the weakest link often defined the product, his comic pages rippled with a locust swarm of ideas that challenged Newton, Darwin, Einstein, and Bohm, that combined the superhuman dream with accelerated technology on a quest to discover the secrets of the galaxy. And that was his best storytelling, like the cosmos, almost infinite, with unexpected solar winds, explosive novas, and apocalyptic discoveries, capable of restoring a sense of wonder to even the most jaded sensibilities. It is no surprise that Kirby's work touched, energized, and changed the lives of millions who experienced his magic. Musician Gregg Bendian is one of them, and on this uniquely experimental album, he pays audio kinetic tribute to a man who saw the future of the future and inspired generations of creative voices. It's a warp drive extravaganza across the event horizon and into the starlit paradoxes of the interzone. Kirby would approve by what you're about to experience. Steranko.
Talk about some comic book vernacular going on there, man. That's pretty awesome.
and still just such an amazing moment for me as an artist to be able to bring together those two worlds. And I'm eternally grateful to Duncan Rouleau for that.
Well, I thank you, for having me be part of it. Honestly, the minute that you had mentioned it, I wanted to be part of it because I couldn't agree with you more. And I also think you accomplished really quite a wonderful piece of music there. It captured, not only does it capture his music, and I do think it captures his art in a way that I've never heard anybody else. And even with the soundtracks that they have for the Marvel stuff, and I like a lot of that stuff. That's more of a comment on superheroes. What you got on this piece is Kirby. You know what I mean? It isn't a bigger genre that it's a big enough genre that you got with Kirby, and of the time too, of the time that he created, and the timelessness. Like I think that Steranko thing of the future of the future. I think that you really captured that by still also honoring some of the stuff that some of the soundscapes that came out of the time that he was creating too, and when he was at the height of it. You drew on that stuff, but then you pulled it forward. And I think that was, there's an old saying, don't do what your heroes did, go where they were going, right?
Yes.
And I think you accomplished that. I think you accomplished that with that album. So
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I mean, certainly the vision for it was that one foot would be in the jazz world of even film noir, what his time would have been, what maybe the sounds of his time would have been, but also like really sci-fi electronica, the machinery, the mother box, it was a real effort to kind of look at more of his general concepts,
right,
than it was to say, oh, here's the Silver Surfer, or here's, Captain America. No. And so my liner note, which I'm not going to read, but if you can find a copy, because it's now a collector's item, but in my essay, I talked about the creation of worlds. And that's what each piece was for me, was this is this world that he created. Here's his cityscape. Here's his machinery. Here's the scientist in the laboratory. Here is the artist at the board. Here's me responding to the artist. So I always like that multi-level thing. And also I love the fact that when you were art directing on it, you said, well, what do you want me to do? And I said, the only thing that I want you to do is draw caricatures of the band, so that we were in the comic world too. And I want to show people that, because that's a hell of a lot of fun. So what we did was Duncan did the band, and that's me, Nels Cline, Alex Cline, and Joel Hamilton, in the style that would have some Kirby crackle and would have whatever angles in our bone structure would be the most advantageous to making us characters. And then the only photograph would be of Jack. So we were all comic characters and he was real.
Right.
And I liked that flip. And I know that you were really on board with that. And man, the whole thing is just such a blast.
Yeah. No, and I've actually over the years have talked to different people who have come up to me and talked to me about it at conventions. So
really,
yeah. There's it's out there. I've had long conversations with a couple of different people about different pieces, and I think what you were saying there about, well, all the stuff that you were saying about the worlds, and I think that is really honestly where I think it has legs. It really does, because if you were to get too specific, all of a sudden, you could find people go, well, that's not what I think about the Silver Surfer or what I think about. But the idea that you were kind of floating in the and the cosmic crackle there, and kind of finding these little vignettes to discuss. I think that was just really the best approach. It was really strong. It really worked. So,
well, eternal gratitude to you and to everyone that came on board for that. I mean, to have been able to collaborate with Stan Lee, to be able to tell him specifically in our conversations that the vocabulary that I learned reading Marvel Comics had a huge impact on my life as a young man. You know,
same here. No, I mean, I think it's very important if you get the opportunity. And I know that everybody's like, I don't know what I'm going to say to this person or whatever. When I find somebody who really has moved me, I mean, they've provided me with some kind of, I mean, they've helped define my world for me. You know, they've either been the soundtrack, you know, of my life, or they've helped create my worldview. I simply say thank you. You could move on. I mean, I don't know beyond that, but I needed to tell those guys when I met them, just thank you. Thank you. You know, I know that they hear it all the time, but I needed to say it. That's the important thing here, as I know that, and you know what? Who's gonna cringe at a thanks? You know, like nobody's gonna cringe at that. I don't need to know what, you know, your favorite Pez are or anything like that, you know, but just thank you. Seriously, what you did for me is fantastic, and I'm going to try and do my best to carry that kind of thing on for other people. You paid it forward, and now I'm going to try and do it too. So just want you to know that was your influence.
Yes, and I think paying it forward is a huge, important thing in my life. Whenever I get a chance to meet any of the people that have been important to me. I mean, when Mahavishnu Project played with Jan Hammer at Moogfest, and the opposite act was Keith Emerson Band, of course I'm going to go up to Keith Emerson and say, "Excuse me, but you made classical music cool for me." And he said, "Glad to be of service." And that was the interaction, and that was it. But he was, and then I also told him, and I was there for the piano concerto at Madison Square Garden. And he said, "Which night?" And I said, "The second night." He said, "That was the one." You know, and no one ever probably says I was at the piano concerto.
Right.
So, and I bank on these kinds of things where it's important to me, but I also think they deserve it and they're owed it.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. And more, and if anything, it keeps me focused on the whole point of all of this too, right? You know,
Yep.
That's the whole point of this stuff is a gratefulness. There's a gratefulness. And so when you're doing stuff, there's a level of gratefulness that you have, right? Because you can get caught up in your own successes and ego and all the other kind of bullshit that you can get caught up into. But if you can just kind of remember that you're grateful that you are part of something way far larger, and that people before you helped you, and maybe hopefully, you know, you're going to do some of that for some other people. And just to kind of keep you in the right headset, just be able to say thanks.
Did you get to meet Jack?
Never got to meet Jack. So that's why I went to his site, because I when I first moved out here, I was doing more film work and wasn't kind of involved in the comic scene, and I wasn't going down to the San Diego Comic Cons where he was at that particular point. It's actually one of my regrets, to be quite honest, but it is what it is. So
Steranko lambasted me. He said, "You could have met him."
Yeah,
I know.
I mean, you could have just ended with Steranko lambasted you. That would be okay. He's lambasted me. Him and Howard Jacob, both of them, both sweethearts, incredibly talented, but they're not necessarily always the most unlambasty of kind of people.
Love it. Love every minute of it.
Yeah.
He said, "Listen, pal, you should have been there. You should have met him. You should have let him."
No, I actually regret that. I've had some wonderful interaction. I got to buy Gil Kane a drink and just tell him how much I loved his work. I got to thank John Buscema when I was a kid, and really appreciated what he did for me. And I got to tell Stan the same thing. So There's some other people I've gotten to talk to, but those were big ones. I got to talk to Neil Adams and tell him that as well. I have friendships with some of these guys now too, so that's different. I mean, there's a professional level on it. There's a friendship level. I've gotten have a nice long conversation with Len Wein, and talk to him on several occasions, and just say, hey, first off, before we get into actual work and all that stuff, I'm a fan. Thank you.
Yeah.
You're one of the reasons I'm doing this as well. And I just wanted to say thank you for helping me kind of figure some shit out.
Oh, yeah. When I got the Todd Rundgren gig, I had to tell him right away. I said, I grew up with that stuff, and
yeah,
this is what it means to me. And then after a while, I was like, okay, I know.
Yeah, that's right.
Go back there now, play the drums and just shut up. And but I had to learn. It's one of those things when you go from fan to collaborator, you have to learn that.
Yeah.
That it can't be that same thing anymore.
That's right.
No,
that's right. And also, I think the only thing that I would add to that is, if you are going to be working with people that are your heroes or people that have really deeply influenced you, what you need to do is respect the situation that you're in with them and be prepared. Be as prepared to be of service of what they need, and also what you need too, but be prepared. Prepare yourself. If you're going to be in the room there, make sure you damn well should be in the room there, and that's somebody else. That, I think, to me is that's what you do, right? When you're working with people that you really respect, is you be on your A game, man.
Well, also, when you have 30 years to prepare for that moment.
That's right. But you know what? You can prepare for 30 years, but are you prepared for that moment? That's always the big question. Is that the right moment? I don't know. You prepared as best as you can for any of those kind of moments when they show up, that you know what you're doing and that you're a professional. So, that's what they need at that point. They don't need a fan. They need a professional.
Yeah. And they need someone that is aware of where they're trying to make something happen and how they're trying to make it happen. And you have sort of the background of what they have done. So their body of work, should be there for you to offer back to them.
That's right. You can access it, and you can go, hey, in this thing and that thing, so I can offer this part, like kind of what you did there, but it's a variation or whatever. And they'll recognize it. They know that stuff. So yeah, be prepared.
Duncan Rouleau, you're one of my heroes. Tell people what you're up to these days, please.
I work with Man of Action. That's my collective with 3 other guys: Joe Casey, Joe Kelly, and Stephen T. Siegel. And at the moment, we're working on, it's been announced, so I can say it, a big, giant, long-form story of Sonic the Hedgehog for Netflix. So this is going to be unlike any of the other stuff. It's going to be an actual drama action thing. It's a big budget, so it's going to be, there'll be plenty of comedy and stuff like that. But this is actually a real story, Game of Thrones style, in the sense that it's it's installments of a big giant story, 26 episodes. So being done by Wild Brain Animation, a house out of Canada. But the missive that they said, they want this to be the best thing that's ever come out of Canada. And if you know animation, they have a lot of really great creative studios there, and working with a really talented cast. So we've been working on that for a while now. Big show. We're show running that. So I'm looking forward to, people will see that in about 2 years. Working on a bunch of other smaller stuff. Got a comic book that I've written, but good friend of mine, Sean McManus. I don't know if you know who he is, but he's probably the most famous. He did some Sandman with Neil Gaiman. He also did The Death of Craven, which was one of his stories. Is great horror stuff, but he also does kind of a cartoony kind of style of stuff. He does a lot. He's done a lot of stuff for DC over the years.
Kind of painterly stuff.
Well, he can do painterly stuff. He also did some Sandman Mystery Theater. So if I was to kind of compare him to anybody, which is always a little bit of it, because I think he's actually a unique artist. He's got a little Wagner in him, I suppose. And, but anyway, so doing a big nine issue story with him. We've been working on that, and that should be coming out at the beginning of next year. So
On what?
Through Image,
Image.
because Man of Action has their bullet with Image. We all of our original stuff we put through Image books for the most part. That and oh boy, I mean, so many things I can't talk about, unfortunately. Some feature stuff too. Working with a big actor on a project at the moment. English fella who's known for his Shakespearean backlog of stuff, but we're working with him on a project
Wow.
that he'll be directing. So little bit of this and that. I'm always trying to keep my fingers in a million different projects because I've got ADHD on top of dyslexia.
Join the club, brother.
Exactly. There's our strengths, man.
They say that it is an indicator of hyperactivity.
There you go. Maybe it is. You know what? I've noticed over the years, anybody who has anything and everybody has something. So that's the other thing. I'm always telling my kids, like, stop worrying about it. Everybody's got something. Nobody doesn't have something, embrace what you've got. But I do think that people who have stuff that overcome in general, they usually have a tougher skin than other people who've had it a little easier. I think so. Maybe having those problems and thrown in front of you you got to look at them as blessings too sometimes. So.
Well, man, this has been such a blast talking to you.
I really appreciate it. Thank you. And I suppose we should, however you want to sign off, maybe we'll sign.
I'll sign off by saying thank you, Duncan Rouleau. You're the best, man. And always will thank you and always tell people about your help in making one of my dreams come true as an artist. Mm-hmm. And look for live from 2001 Requiem for Jack Kirby tour footage, not footage, but audio that's going to come out from some amazing shows that we did on that tour with different bass players, but in this case with Alex Nels Cline and Kermit Driscoll on bass. And that'll probably be up on my Bandcamp. And look for Duncan Rouleau's stuff. He's got a lot of stuff coming out. And I thank everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time on the ProgCast.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Take care. It's been a great time.